Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, we don't know when the next Ontario election will be held, but that's not stopping Bonnie Crombie's Liberals from unveiling a major campaign-style tax reform policy.
The province's plan to rip up bike lanes in Toronto has a price tag.
Some progress for Wildland firefighters dealing with cancer care, mental health, and other issues. But could the province do better for these first responders?
And your column, my column, focuses on some more bad news for Ontario's housing plans.
And in my column, we're going to remember a former Ontario cabinet minister and, more importantly, a really good guy who would have been 60 years old today had he not perished in a tragic freak explosion 5 years ago.
It's Friday, November 15th, 2024, so let's get to it.
JMM?
Oh, sir.
Good to see you, pal.
Good to see you.
I wanted to start by updating everybody on something we talked about last week, which was the triumphant return to Queen's Park by 100-year-old Lieutenant General Richard Romer, who, yes, got the invitation after missing a few years because of his health, got the invitation from Premier Ford to return to Queen's Park, give the speech at Remembrance Day ceremonies, and I'm wearing the same thing today I wore on Monday at Queen's Park at the Remembrance Day ceremonies, Juno, 1944, lest we forget. He came, he saw, he conquered, if I can borrow an expression. He did a great job and spoke on behalf of the troops, 100 years old, at the lectern. And if you know General Romer, as most people do, you knew that he wasn't going to let the Premier get off scot-free. And actually, Sheldon, can we just do this here? You want to scroll through some of the pictures from last Monday at Queen's Park? This is November 11th. Here's the General. He needs a walker now, but he's still pretty good. He comes in, chest full of medals. Remember, he was, somebody in a speech referred to Juno Beach, 1944, D-Day, and apparently the general leaned over to somebody he was sitting beside and he said, "I was there." And I guarantee you he was the only guy at that service.
I mean, if you had been there, you would be reminding people of that too.
He was there, yes, indeed. That's Laura Smith. Now, she's the MPP for Thornhill. This is after the service is over. She's thanking him for his service. We don't really have a Veterans Affairs Minister at Queen's Park, so Laura Smith is the parliamentary assistant who is responsible for the military file, if you like. And so she wanted, on behalf of the government, to thank the general for coming. There's Doug Ford at the lectern, and he's sort of pointing to that black granite wall, which General Romer chaired the committee to get that thing built. This was back when Dalton McGuinty was Premier of Ontario. And the general sort of snuck in an etching of his Mustang plane that he flew back during World War II, and that's somewhere on that wall. And at one point, when he was at the microphone, he said to Premier Ford, "Now look, the south side of the wall looks great, we love that, but the north side of the wall is black and has nothing." And he said, "I've been trying for years to get any government to put on there, engrave in there, Ontario Veterans Memorial or something like that." And he looked at Premier Ford and he said, "Now, Premier Ford, you're supposed to be a guy who can get things done, so I'm saying to you, let's get this done." We'll see if the Premier comes through for him. Anyway, it was really terrific to see him back there and looking so good, sounding so good, back where he belongs.
And I imagine the Premier put on the spot like that is giving some thought to seeing what he can do.
I guarantee you he is.
With that, on to issue one.
Right on. Ontario Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie announced her first major campaign promise, a tax cut for the middle class and a cut to the HST on home heating bills. Let's have a look.
As Premier, I'll immediately do two things to put more money back into your pockets. First, I'll cut your income taxes. And then I'll get rid of the sales tax on home heating and hydro bills. This will be the largest tax relief for the people of Ontario in over a decade.
Let's get some more deets on this, if you would, JMM.
Yeah, absolutely. So in total, the cuts are projected to cost about $2.8 billion. Of course, the way the Liberal Party is phrasing this, and this is something they've borrowed from the Tories, this will deliver $2.8 billion in relief to taxpayers. just an accounting identity, one way or the other. The tax cut would amount to about $950 annually to the average household. Sorry, that's the income tax cut. And then the HST cut would provide 5 million households with about $200.
You won't be surprised the first questions that came at the press conference were, okay, Leader Crombie, how are you going to pay for all this? And her answer was, I'm going to stop the giveaways. And by that she meant the $200 checks that the Ford government is going to mail out to people in the new year, $500 million for a parking lot for a waterfront spa, $225 million for the brewers to end an agreement 1 year early, $2 billion in lost revenue from scrapping the cap-and-trade anti-pollution system, et cetera, et cetera. She says the government has made choices. They are the wrong choices. She says she would make better choices, different choices than the Premier. And actually, while we're on the subject here, do you want to compare the tax cut that she is offering to the $200 rebate checks that the Premier is offering? What's the diff?
Well, there's a few differences here. I mean, the government is talking about this check as a one-time dividend, if you like. It doesn't affect the overall rate of income taxes that you pay. The tax cuts proposed by Crombie here are actually, I mean, they would lower your income tax rate, and they would be permanent, or at least as permanent as any change in the tax code is. So, the Liberals here are trying to, I think it's fair to say, outflank the Progressive Conservatives on the tax file.
That is very unconventional thinking in politics, and we should spend a second here just talking about this, because the conventional wisdom in politics has always been, if one party owns an issue, you don't compete with them on that issue. You try and make your news on another issue. Now, the Tories have been identified with tax cuts ever since Mike Harris ran as the tax fighter. We're going back to 1990 now. It was the first campaign that he ran as the tax fighter. So it's interesting that the Liberals are choosing to compete on that ground with the Conservatives, just as sort of, if you look at the other side of the coin, Conservatives tend not to try to compete with Liberals on health and education because they figure that's not our issues and we're not going to beat them on that, so we let them have that. Interesting that Bonnie Crombie is really driving in Doug Ford's lane here. I guess we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also in the context, and anybody who's been listening to this podcast for the last few months knows this, the Tories have really spent the past year since she won the leadership trying to brand Bonnie Crombie as, queen of the carbon tax, and they have alleged that she would, increase any number of taxes were she to form government. So this move seems like both a sword against the Tories and also a shield to try and defend herself from the attacks that they're not just coming, they have already started. So it's going to be interesting to judge how it works on both of those aspects, I think.
Sword and a shield.
Yes.
Give me a double sugar. That's a good metaphor, buddy. Didn't see that coming. And with that, let's get off to issue 2. The bill has come due. The cost to remove all those bike lanes in Ontario's capital city, $48 million. And the province says it'll pick up the tab. Next question. How wise an expenditure is this? JMM has some views, I bet.
Sure, absolutely. Let's get some of the numbers down first. These numbers come from a recently released City of Toronto report. It says the cost of installing these bike lanes was $27 million. It suggests that removing them would be more expensive still, as much as $48 million. The staff acknowledged that that's a very incomplete estimate at this point. And they are saying that removing these bike lanes would cause the very congestion that Premier Ford says that he is trying to avoid. So the city is saying that, among other things, removing these bike lanes would also conflict with any number of other provincial policies, including changes to the Planning Act and the provincial policy statements. One thing that I found really interesting, and I'm restraining myself from going too deep on these nerdy details, but when you build like a condo tower in Toronto, the city requires that you build a certain amount of parking spaces, or it used to. And it was always the case that developers would build exactly the number of parking spaces that they were required to and no more, because parking is very expensive. One of the things that the city report notes is that actually recently they've seen the opposite, that developers are building more bike parking than they are required to by the zoning bylaw. It's obviously cheaper so they don't mind that. It gives them goodwill with council. They don't mind that. But there's also demand for it. So those are just some of the things that I took from the city report that I found very interesting.
There has been a lot of fudging on the numbers here by all sides, I think. I know the Premier and his Transportation Minister keep saying, look, we're ripping these bike lanes out because only 1.2% of Torontonians commute to work, and therefore we're not going to curry favor with this little, small, insignificant part of the population. How accurate is that 1.2% number?
Not at all, in short. We always knew that was, frankly, a suspect number. We've known for a while that the number actually dates back to 2011. I'm going to gently suggest to people that there are more cyclists on the road than there were in 2011. And it refers to commutes done across the entire Toronto census metropolitan area, which is a much, much wider area than just the city of Toronto itself. It includes like Orangeville. It's just not a relevant geography to compare to here. We do have more recent data, more substantial data. The city participates in what's called the Transportation Tomorrow Survey. It is a survey run by the Provincial Ministry of Transportation. It helps the province plan its transportation priorities over years and even more than a decade. The city kind of sort of wasn't supposed to release this data, and yet it was somehow provided to the Toronto Star. And the data suggests that, look, no surprise, cyclists are still a minority among commuters. I certainly have never argued otherwise. But when we're talking about downtown Toronto, which I think is the most relevant geography here, where most of these bike lanes are or where they lead to, motorists are not the most common commuters either. Transit users are. 45% of commutes into the downtown are by transit, 25% by car, and 9% by bike. So another way to put that is, frankly, in a city where there's still a lot of hostility to cyclists and cycling infrastructure, cyclists make up a third as many commuters in the downtown area as motorists.
And you're just referring there to commuting for work. There's obviously a lot of cycling that happens outside of going to work, coming home from work.
Hop on the bike, go get the groceries, that kind of thing, right? There's a lot more to our lives than just going to and from work.
Exactly right. Now, we know, of course, the Mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, is a big advocate for cycling. She wants these lanes in here. She's not pleased about the fact that they're being ripped out, even if the province is offering to pay for it. But here's the big question. Is there anything she can actually do about this?
So let's turn our minds back to Bill 5, the law from for its first term in office that cut Toronto City Council in half, right? The Supreme Court eventually found in a 5-4 decision that that law was constitutional because municipalities are merely creatures of the province, as we like to say. So at the end of the day, if the legislature puts its foot down, no, there is really nothing that Toronto City Council can do through its powers or through the mayor's powers that could trump provincial law.
She's got one thing going for her. She's got the bully pulpit. That's it, right?
And she's using that, like that's, she did not like write this report that we're pulling all of these numbers from, but she did use her the powers of her office to get staff to put those numbers together. She is making the most forceful argument for these bike lanes that she can. And I don't think this is the end of it by any means. I think every single controversial decision that the Ford government has made since 2018 has been challenged in court. And I suspect that we will see some kind of court challenge launched here as well. I'm not sure exactly what those grounds are. There are things that, whether it's provincial or federal or municipal jurisdiction, like no Canadian government can violate the charter. Will somebody make a charter argument about this? We'll see.
We shall see. I know one thing. We're going to talk about this a week Monday on the agenda on whether Doug Ford really wants to be the Premier of Ontario or the Mayor of Toronto, because that is a big subject for discussion at Queen's Park. And with that, we're off to issue 3. Let's talk about firefighting for a moment. There is a bill that's been making its way through the legislature called Bill 190, and it has now received royal assent, which means it's now the law. It amended a variety of worker-related things, including removing the need to provide a sick note to your employer. But one amendment in particular has drawn attention to wildland firefighters. JMM, the deets, if you would.
Right. So the amendment to this act that was has now been passed would make it easier for wildland firefighters to receive what's called presumptive coverage, which, as the name implies, it presumes that if you have gotten an illness, that you got that illness because of the work you are doing. This is common for not just wildland firefighters, but if you think of firefighters in cities, for example, you tend to inhale a lot of smoke, and sometimes that smoke isn't just wood. Sometimes it's more harmful substances that burn, and so lung infections and lung diseases are very common among firefighters. And so when we talk about workplace safety insurance, these kinds of compensations, one of the rules is just if you get these kinds of diseases, rather than arguing about, was this really caused by your employment, and going through all those arguments, the presumption is just if you've gotten this condition, then you are presumed to have gotten through it through work, and your employer, in this case the government of Ontario, will just pay for your treatment or whatever is required. And so this will just make it easier for those workers to get the kind of compensation that they would get in other contexts.
In which case, what's the issue here?
Well, under the Act, wildland firefighters now receive this coverage after 10 years of service rather than 15. However, this is, I think, this is the kind of detail you see a lot in government. A fire season only counts as a half year of service. So you need to actually accrue 20 years of wildland firefighting to be eligible for 10 years of service.
Because 20 equals 10 at Queen's Park.
Yes, exactly. Now, the province doesn't have, it could, I suppose, legislate this kind of change. They are instead working with the Workplace Safety Insurance Board to change this kind of rule.
Okay. What else is up on this? What else do we need to know?
Well, as you can probably guess, wildland firefighting is very dangerous. Just aside from the obvious danger of fighting fires, cancer is the leading cause of death for these workers. It is also, as you can imagine, very stressful, very mentally taxing. There is a lot of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, among these firefighters. Wildland firefighters have long called for acknowledgement of these dangers and certainly more education for trainees on the job. There's also, again, one of these details that you see all the time in government. There's an issue of classification. Wildland firefighters are not actually classified as firefighters the way that the province, firefighters at the municipal level, their labor conditions are governed by a certain provincial law. Wildland firefighters are not. They are called resource technicians. OPSU, the union representing wildland firefighters, would like to see their classification changed. That could result in higher pay, longer retention, and better benefits.
I'm not asking you to take a position on this, but presumably if these folks are getting sick doing work that we really need them to do, it behooves us to do right by them. Fair to say?
Yes, I think so. And this has been an ongoing issue. I mean, we saw how bad the wildfire season could get a few years ago, where, I was biking to work wearing an N95 because the sky in August here in Toronto was like orange from, fire smoke. I think we are likely to continue to need at least as many wildland firefighters in the future. And one of the other issues, and we're not even talking about that here so much, but OPSU has really raised a lot of concerns about whether we are funding this service at the levels that will be needed in the future, given a warming planet.
We'll keep an eye on this story as it percolates through the legislature. And with that, it's off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular weekly feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns that we wrote for the TVO website this past week. What do you got for us today?
Well, I actually can't reminisce about this one because it has not yet been published due to some unforeseen circumstances. I'm actually going to get to give our listeners a preview of what is coming early next week, probably on Monday. There is a new report from the FAO, this is the Financial Accountability Office, of course, that says that in 2024, Ontario's cost of living crisis is overwhelmingly a housing cost crisis. Inflation outside of shelter costs is now less than 1%. The bad news is that housing starts are abysmal, and the 1.5 million new homes target that the government has set is more or less entirely out of reach. Obviously, really bad news from the FAO. There is, I suspect, more coming because there is a press conference at Queen's Park on Monday with a variety of environmental groups in a coalition. They are releasing a report saying that they are giving the government a grade on its housing policies, knowing who makes up this coalition. I very, very strongly suspect that it will not be a passing grade, unless maybe it's a gentleman's C. I will be at that press conference on Monday morning, and I will be writing about all of this for the website. I expect that column will be up either Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning.
Excellent.
How about you, Steve?
Well, I wrote a column that I guess I would describe as bittersweet this week. It was about a guy that maybe our listeners or viewers will remember, a guy named David Kaplan, who was a cabinet minister during the Dalton McGuinty years at Queen's Park. David, actually, it's a bit of a family story. His mother was both a North York City councillor, an Ontario MPP, and a federal MP. And when she left provincial to go federal, creating a by-election, David went in there and won the seat. So he followed in his mother's footsteps. She was health minister. He was health minister. Followed in his mother's footsteps in that way, too. He was also the infrastructure minister. How do I put this? To this date, no one is actually 100% sure what happened 5 years ago when David was home alone. He was expected to go up to his family's cottage and join the rest of his family there, but there was an explosion in the house, and David was killed from the injuries sustained in that explosion. And I wanted to write about him today because today, the 15th of November, he would have been 60 years old. A couple weeks ago, Toronto City Councillor Shelley Carroll, well, I guess it goes back further than that, she got the wheels in motion to an event that happened 2 or 3 weeks ago, where David had a park named in his honor in Don Mills. And if we can, Sheldon, let's scroll through some of the pictures here and we'll just go back. There is the sort of wide shot of the new David Kaplan Park in Don Mills. Right across the road from this, incidentally, is his old constituency office. So it's in the neighborhood of where he spent so much of his time. There he is getting sworn in. I'm not sure which election that is, him getting sworn in, probably the first one, surrounded by his staff at Queen's Park. That was a big day, following in Mom's footsteps. And there's his mother, Eleanor, on the left with his widow, Lee, and then his son, Jacob, on the right, giving a speech at the opening of the park. And it was, I got to say, there weren't too many dry eyes in the house. It was a pretty lovely moment seeing this. And that's David's final resting place up in York Region in the city of Vaughan. David would have been 60 today. He spent a lot of time when he was at Queen's Park working on a bill called Places to Grow, which you know all about as a planning guy. Basically governing growth. Here's where we can intensify. Here's where we really shouldn't do any development at all. And everybody kind of agreed that it was a beautiful thing that David got a park. He spent a lot of time working for families and working to ensure adequate park space and places for families to take their kids. So for all of those reasons, I wanted to write about David Kaplan this week. And I add this postscript.
Yes.
The guy who produces our podcast, Matthew O'Mara, let me know that when David Kaplan was an MPP, Matthew was one of his constituents. And Matthew also, I guess when he was a little kid, was a page at Queen's Park. And he met with David when he was a page at his constituency office, actually ahead of applying for the program. He got some pointers. I think David gave him some souvenir pins. And he credits David Kaplan, along with his parents, with helping him, Matthew, get his start along the path that has now seen him produce a weekly podcast about Queen's Park. So the people whom David Kaplan influenced, the list is very long.
Well, and I will just add one other milestone. My first time on TVO's airwaves with you on an agenda panel included David Kaplan and other people, but I only met him very briefly, but he was immediately just lovely and kind and extremely warm. And, one of those people who, when he died, you could see the shock move through Queen's Park that day. It was really sad.
Was he the minister when he was on that show with you? Do you recall?
No, he was a former MPP at that point.
He was former,
but
okay.
He was speaking on behalf of the Liberals, I believe, on that panel.
Okay, because I do remember him when he was a minister coming on the agenda with critics, which is something ministers almost never do. I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of ministers who have been brave enough to come on our program and have a debate with his or her critics. And David did it. And I thought, there's a guy who kind of has confidence in what he's doing. He believes in what he's doing. And he's not afraid to have the debate in a public place with others, which he did with his typical civility. Anyway, we remember David Kaplan today.
And with that, let's go to the mailbag.
If you've got a burning question or an insightful comment, we always love hearing from you. The email address is onpolitics@tvo.org. Get us started, JMM.
Right. We have a letter from Ivan Mirko Sanjanovic from Toronto who writes, Dear On Poly Podcast, I have a hypothetical question that might be fun to entertain. And indeed, it was fun to entertain. With the dominance of the PC party in Ontario, are there any legalistic obstacles that would prevent a one-time NDP Liberal coalition with a single mandate to institute preferential voting and then immediately call another election afterwards? Cheers, IMS.
Well, this really is an unusual scenario. Thank you for the question, Yvonne. Now, a little background here. Ranked balloting was something that the previous Liberal government in Ontario passed and allowed. Said municipalities, you want to do ranked balloting, where you don't just go to the poll and pick one choice, you pick your first, second, third, fourth choices and so on. And then the bottom candidate drops off and those votes are reassigned so that whoever wins actually, at the end of the day, gets more than 50% of the votes. For many people, there's an added legitimacy to that system. Anyway, some municipalities were using that system. When Doug Ford became premier, he canceled that form of elections.
Yes.
So, to answer, Yvonne, your direct question, if the PCs were not to win a majority in the next election, there is nothing legally preventing the New Democrats, Liberals, and Greens from combining forces, defeating the government, setting up a coalition government, changing the voting system, and then seeking a new mandate on the voting system by calling an immediate election. There's nothing illegal about that. Now, that's not to say it's not complicated. And McGrath, you give the complications.
Right. So, and these are not legalistic complications, but they are political ones. So let's start with it costs $150 million, give or take, to hold an election. Would you want to spend that much money again so soon? Would you be able to answer to the voters for spending that much money so soon? What would turnout be like the second time around? Would turnout increase because there's this new exciting way to vote? Or would turnout drop because people would say, oh, like we just did this. The Tories would not unjustifiably cry foul because this would be opposition parties changing the voting system really specifically to harm the Progressive Conservative Party and change it in a very substantial way, right? Under the first past the post system, we functionally give 100% of the political power to a party that gets 40% of the vote. But maybe the showstopper here is that the New Democrats and Liberals do not agree on preferential or ranked ballots. The NDP have a very, very long history of supporting proportional representation. They have, federally, we saw this play out where the Liberals proposed ranked balloting and the NDP very strongly reacted against it. They believe that ranked balloting will sort of structurally prefer the Liberals for, all time to come and don't particularly want that system. The Liberals, of course, conversely believe that proportional representation will just help the NDP and hurt them. So even if you stipulated that the parties were willing to do this kind of one-time coalition deal, getting them to actually agree on the specific electoral reform is really who will bell the cat kind of question.
I think what you're saying is it's legal, but ain't no way in hell it's ever going to happen.
Never say never, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it.
Right on. But Yvonne, thanks for the intriguing idea. We did enjoy chewing the fat about that one.
Yes. Before we leave this bit, we do, of course, want to let people know that you can also these days ask us questions on Blue Sky, the relatively new social network. It is more or less like Twitter or formerly Twitter, now X, except I think we previously referred to it as not as many Nazis. Generally, a more pleasant, less toxic atmosphere, and I think we will have our profiles on the screen here.
Want to bring it up there? Oh, there we go. Okay. That's you, right?
That is me, yeah.
Okay. Have I got a profile on this thing, too?
Yes,
there's my profile. Okay, yeah. You got more followers than I do.
We'll see what happens next. I'm sure that many of your fans will now crowd to Blue Sky and
both of them
will get your numbers up. Certainly this is the first time that has happened because even when I came to TVO and I had a lot of Twitter followers for a TVO personality, you still had like way more than I did.
Well, all I can say, McGrath, is it's on. It's on. And I think I might have a couple of more followers than you on X.
Yes, I suspect that's true. I have just under 30,000 on Twitter, formerly X or whatever.
I have a couple of more than that.
Yeah, couple.
I think so. Anyway, yes, indeed. Blue Sky Social, we invite you to follow us there as well.
Right, and you can always ask questions about content on the podcast. The old-fashioned way, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the onpoli podcast for this Friday, November 15th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is the vice president of programming and content.
They want us to get out of here, so no specific shout out today for any member of the crew, but we do always love to thank the crew for setting things up and making the podcast look so darn good. Until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.